Cheers. Thanks, David. It's very nice to be here on this auspicious occasion. My talk today, it's a very simple talk actually, very sort of low level or high level, whichever way you'd like to think about it. First, a few words about evolution. Then, seeing as I'm a mathematician, why maths? And finally, just three examples really of how simple models can be actually very useful, though sometimes they can be a little dangerous as well. I think it's useful to think about evolution as really having two parts. There's the, if you like, the pattern, the idea that all life on Earth traces back to a common ancestor, and maybe that's described by a tree or a network or whatever. But there's also an explanation for how evolution occurred, namely natural selection based on the variation that exists within populations. And Alfred Russel Wallace and Darwin both articulated that, and from that point on, that is now the way we viewed the world. If we look at this way of thinking about evolution, most of the interesting mathematics that took place early on, particularly after Mendel had come along and said, well, this is how genetics works, was really devoted to process, population genetics. How is it that a population can evolve through natural selection? And some of the pioneers, the early people in this field, are well known to, I'm sure all of you, people like Sir Ron Fisher, who's one of the creators of statistics as we know it today. But a lot of the work he did was motivated by and based on trying to understand natural selection. Indeed, there is Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection, for example. But others also, such as his American counterpart, Sewell Wright, also worked very actively in this field. And then there's this wonderful character, Jack Haldane, who used to come out with these lovely lines like, "An ounce of algebra is worth a ton of verbal argument." Quite like that one as a mathematician. Or asked if he would give his life for his brother, he said, no, but I would for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. Okay, so these guys and others put together what was sometimes called the new synthesis, but there were some things they really couldn't explain very well. For example, altruism. Why is it that some animals would put themselves at a disadvantage to help the community? It didn't seem like survival of the fittest could explain this. But then along came Bill Hamilton, almost a Kiwi. His parents were. He was born in Cairo, I believe. And he really gave an explanation for that. The other thing they couldn't really explain is animal behaviour or in general the behaviour of organisms, and that's where people like John Maynard Smith came along and used game theory, or more precisely the concept of evolutionary stable strategies to provide a very good explanation for things like fight or flight and so forth. And finally, I mean, all these guys were fellows of the Royal Society or whatever, but who recognises this young chap over here? Probably not many of you. I certainly wouldn't have until I read about him fairly recently, George Price. He's not well known. In fact, he died destitute in London, and the only 2 people at his funeral were these 2, because this guy, Hamilton, was the only one who realised just how brilliant this guy was. He proved this thing called Price's theorem that includes, as special cases, Fisher's fundamental theorem, everything Bill Hamilton had done. It's a very nice body of theory, very simple actually, but it had just gone unnoticed. It was under everyone's noses for 40 years and nobody realised it. And not even when he was alive did anyone realise it until Bill Hamilton looked more closely. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here. Let me get back to the story. What about pattern? Well, mathematicians didn't get involved very much in pattern at all, but biologists did. They started drawing their idea of what the tree of life might have looked like. This is Ernst Haeckel, one of his many drawings. So you have plants animals and bugs. That was his tree of life, 3 divisions, and we still have 3 divisions today. It's just that they are bugs, and out here in a tiny little corner of the eukaryotes are plants and animals. So it's still, he was sort of right, there are 3 branches, but they're not quite the ones he envisaged. Mathematicians didn't really get involved in this enterprise until relatively recently, compared to the population genetics story. But this whole field of phylogenetics has become applied in all sorts of areas. It's not just in the areas I've indicated there, but in language evolution, for example. It's being used more recently in studying the evolution of tumours. It's been used to classify single malt whiskey. It's very useful. But some of the mathematical and statistical approaches really had to wait, I suppose, to the 60s and early 70s when people started looking at blood types, protein sequences, and then eventually genetic sequences. And statisticians, Anthony Edwards, and independently Joe Felsenstein, looked at developing likelihood-based methods. David Sankoff, a mathematician in Canada, always 10 years ahead of the rest of the world. In fact, till recently I was still getting papers to review where I'd have to just write back and see Sankoff's 1973 paper. Okay, so why maths? I mean, maths is brilliantly useful in physics. It works almost too well. The Hungarian-American physicist Eugene Paul Weiner had that to say. But in biology, the case is perhaps less compelling. Giancarlo Rota, the lack of real contact between mathematics and biology is either a tragedy, a scandal, or a challenge, and it's hard to decide which. Well, you know, that was 1986. Lots happened since then, I guess, but the case is clearly not as well established. And Darwin, well, Darwin didn't particularly like maths. In fact, in his autobiographic notes, he said he attempted it and even went during the summer with a very private tutor. I like this, a very dull man, to Barmouth, but I got on very slowly. But then, interestingly, he goes on to say the following: "This impatience was very foolish, and in later years I deeply regretted that I did not proceed far enough to at least understand something of the great leading principles of mathematics." So there we are. Some have argued that maybe it's just as well Darwin didn't know more maths, because if he tried to model natural selection as he saw it, which was blending of characteristics rather than the discrete Mendelian scenario, he might well have come to reject his very theory. Okay, so what sort of maths do we use in these two parts of evolution? Well, quite different sorts of maths. When we look at phylogenetics, for instance, the key drivers are discrete maths, combinatorics, and algorithms, whereas for population genetics, it's more standard calculus or differential equations, or as my colleagues sometimes derisively say, steam engine mathematics. However, there's one thing I've left out here, and it's something that both of these branches of evolution use, and that is stochastic theory, probability theory. It's essential to both. Evolution is a random process. The evolution of trees, the evolution of species on trees, the evolution of populations by natural selections. There have been various hard-nosed computer scientists who try to think of evolution as some sort of purely deterministic process that doesn't really seem to work. What's changed in the last 15 years? A huge amount has changed. When I started a long time ago, people were using parsimony. That was the way you should go. Then eventually Felsenstein and others convinced practitioners to use likelihood. But now, of course, we've got Bayesian software that works brilliantly well. Now we have not just a single gene. We're often analyzing thousands of genes for the same group of species. The types of data has changed enormously with next generation sequencing. You now have well-developed mathematical theory that allows for algorithms that can handle things like incomplete lineage sorting. And phylogenetic networks has been a really big growth area, and several people in this room here have worked on this as well, and visualization tools. You know, how do you visualize a tree or a network with a huge number of taxa on it? We saw a nice example of that in Alexi's talk of these showing the uncertainty between different trees. The other thing that's changed is software. So now I have to tell a little story. Was it 14 years ago, I was invited to examine Alexi's PhD thesis, and I read it. I was very impressed. Oh gosh, this guy's clever. But I thought, this Bayesian stuff, you know, this will never catch on. I was getting on the plane to fly up to Auckland, where Alan Rodrigo was organising the oral, and I think the other examiner report I had to present, I think was Felsenstein, or yeah. Anyway, it seems I was wrong. Yeah, I mean, clearly programs like Beasts have really transformed the field if you see how much it's being used. But there's other methods as well, and NeighbourNet is a very good example of how two mathematicians, in this case David Bryant and Vincent Moulton, but together with a computer scientist, Daniel Husin, can get together and come up with a method that biologists actually use. It's very easy for mathematicians to go away and come up with a very clever method, and no one will ever use it. Okay? But it's one thing to work on problems that people are really interested in, but sometimes it's actually not a bad idea to sit back and say, what are biologists going to want to do in 10 years' time, or maybe 20 years' time? They won't want to do it now, but in 10, 20 years' time they will. A good example of this is a paper by David Robinson, who was from my department. He passed away just a few months ago in Les Falls. I tried very hard to find a photo of David Robinson on the internet. I unfortunately couldn't. This may be explained partly by the fact he's a discrete mathematician. Now, these guys wrote a paper in 1981, and it was hardly cited at all for at least the first 10 years, maybe even 15 years. But suddenly, it's now got 1,300 citations. It's a timeless paper. It'll just keep getting cited forever. And it wasn't that some biologists were saying, oh, we need to do this, we need to compare trees. It was they just realized that people will want to do this someday. So blue skies research is really important. What some sort of manager or politician says, oh, we need this solved, you know, in the next 2 years, that's the important thing. Sure, it's good people work on that, but sometimes it's good also to take a longer term vision. Okay, so I'm going to tell 3 little short stories about simple models and how they can be useful. And I could have talked about lots of things. I'm just going to talk about probability theory because it's common to evolution. So the first example is really of historical interest, but it's worth retelling because I think it's quite interesting. It involves this guy, George Houdini Yule, from way back in the 1920s, and he was sent some data about snakes from one of his colleagues, the Dr. J.C. Willis, Fellow of the Royal Society, and asked, this gentleman had lots of data sets. This is just a typical one where, for example, 131 genera just had a single species in them, 35 had 2 species in them, and so forth. So you had this sort of distribution that decayed, but it had quite a long tail. Okay, it wasn't just like a poisson just going to zero quite quickly. And he asked Yule, can you explain this? And Yule thought for a bit, and he thought, well, maybe we should think of some sort of random process where species split at a constant rate. Now, this model of a splitting tree is now called the Yule Model. It's widely used in Bayesian software packages, for example. And every now and then, a new species that forms is so different that it founds a new genus. So in this model, you have really 2 parameters. You have the rate at which species split off, like this. This is still within the same genus, but every now and then you have an event where a new genus is formed. So you have a rate of speciation, rate of genus formation. And it turns out everything just depends on the ratio of those 2 numbers. No, so you have 1 parameter. If you do that, you can get an exact description of the probability of the number of a species in a genus. And for this data set, if you adjust that single parameter, you get a pretty good fit. This was the worst fit, actually, of all of the data sets given to Yule. So there's a nice example where a simple probability model can help explain something. Here's a second example. This used to worry me a lot when I was a child, that I had 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and so forth, and yet there were fewer people in the past than there is today. That's to make any sense at all. Of course, what happens is they start closing up, don't they? Take 2 people today, they have their family tree, so-called tree, but if you go back far enough, you have these coalescences, they will find a common ancestor. Now, when I talk about ancestor here, I'm not talking about mitochondria, I'm talking about a genealogical ancestor. Okay? So if I take a whole population and go back, way back here, is there going to be a genealogical ancestor? If so, how far back? So Joe Chang at Yale modelled this very nicely. He said, just have a population, each person chooses their parents, the male and female parent, uniformly at random from the previous generation. Okay? And you go back. How far back do you have to go until you find an individual that is an ancestor of everybody at the present? Well, he showed that it's basically in the current population size, you take the log of it to the base 2. In other words, not very many generations. If we were talking about mitochondria, it would be going back exponentially further, because we'd be going back n generations. But he proved a more remarkable thing. If you go back a little bit further, 1.77 log n to the base 2, everybody back then either has everyone today as a descendant or nobody as a descendant. And 80% of the people back there have everyone today as a descendant, 20% have no one today as a descendant. Very sharp result. In fact, if you do a little bit more realism, you can estimate that 300 years ago, the human population, there was someone who was an ancestor to everyone. 3000 BC, there was somebody who is an ancestor of everyone. So just a slip in a little bit of recent work we did, we were interested in this concept of what we call ghosts. A ghost is sort of something like that's everywhere and nowhere. So what is a ghost technically for us? It's an individual in the past who has everyone today as a genealogical descendant, yet contributes nothing genetically to anyone today. And we proved the existence of ghosts. We can prove that they existed about 10,000 years ago. Okay? So part of this is mathematical proof that ghosts exist if you go back far enough. Part of it's simulation based. So there we go. That's okay. The third and final example concerns phylogenetic diversity. So we're living in an age of rapid extinction. This is the tree of all approximately 10,000 species of birds that was published recently. Around the outside here, you see the 575 species that are considered at risk of extinction. And if you add up all of the branch lengths connecting these tips that are at risk, you end up with 2.7 billion years of evolution. Okay, of course, birds have only been around for 65 million years, so how can that be? Well, because they're all evolving together, right? So it's a lot more than 65 million, it's 2.7. So what happens if a certain proportion of leaves in a tree go extinct at random? How much of the tree, the total branch length of the tree, gets lost? Well, there was a much cited paper in Science by Lord Robert May and Sean Nee that suggested that under a null model of extinction, 80% of the underlying tree can survive even when approximately 95% of the species are lost. So this is sounds a little strange, and it certainly has conservation implications and maybe political implications as well. I got interested in this really when Arne Moores contacted me, because he was sort of, I suppose, a little suspicious of this result, and he realized that the model they were using for their trees was what's called the Kingman coalescent model. It's unlike the usual phylogenetic trees. It has very, very short tips and very, very long, deep internal branches. So we said, well, let's redo that analysis under Yule trees, because they tend to approximate what real evolutionary trees will look like. So suppose that you grew a Yule tree and then you prune out, you keep a certain proportion, P, of the leaves at the present. What proportion of the total diversity in the tree is retained? Is it still possible to have something like this? And the lovely thing was, you can do all this mathematically, exactly. You don't need to do simulations. There's this very nice formula you get for the ratio of future diversity to present diversity, minus P log P over 1 minus P. Here's this solid blue curve is what this looks like. But the interesting thing is that rather than 80% of the underlying tree surviving when 95% of the species go extinct, the conclusion you reach is exactly the opposite. 84% of the underlying tree is lost when 95% of the species go extinct. So it's very important doing modelling to just be aware of what you, just because you're using a model you get a conclusion doesn't really mean anything. You need to think about what the assumptions of the model are. Dave, I should stop now? A minute, okay, this will be fast. Where's the field going? Okay, every 5 years, for the last 15 years, I've been boldly putting on my webpage where I think phylogenetics is going, and it's attracted a little bit of interest from Eric Matson, who's saying, well, how's he really doing? But I suddenly realised that it's now 2016, so I've got to do it again. So I'm not going to do it here, but, and you know, I mean, predicting the future is not an easy task. So I just finished with 3 questions I think are kind of, these are not going to be part of my 5 or anything, but I think they're interesting because they are questions that are topical, hard, and where maths can help. So here they are. How best to deal with lateral gene transfer? What were the earliest divergences in life and how did life begin? And I think I should stop there. Thanks.